The request was simple. The response was not. For centuries, humanity had served the Vael'Drak Imperium without question. They had paid their tributes, fought in their wars, and abided by the rigid hierarchy imposed upon them. It was an unspoken promise. Obedience would be rewarded. If they proved themselves loyal, if they endured, they would earn their place as equals. That was the dream. That was the lie. The petition for full citizenship had been sent through the proper channels. Representatives of Earth and its colonies had spent years preparing the arguments, crafting the perfect appeal to the Imperium's ruling council. Humanity had risen above its primitive past. It had conquered disease, expanded beyond its homeworld, and proven its value on countless battlefields. They had shed blood in the Imperium's name. Surely, now, they had earned the right to be more than just subjects. The Vael'Drak's reply arrived within a week. Not a discussion, not a negotiation, a decree. Earth was to be exiled, effective immediately. The words of the proclamation were broadcast across the human colonies, a cold, emotionless verdict delivered by the Imperium's High Chancellor. Humanity shall no longer be recognized as a protected subject race of the Vael'Drak Imperium. For its presumption and insolence, it is henceforth stripped of all rights, privileges, and status. No imperial world shall grant them aid. No ship bearing the human crest shall be permitted to dock in our harbors. Their trade is forbidden. Their voice is silenced. Their home is cast out from our dominion. Let this serve as a lesson to all who would overreach beyond their station. The message ended. The silence that followed was more deafening than the words themselves. The crackdown began immediately. On Earth, the Imperium's enforcers moved swiftly. The orbital docks, once bustling with trade ships and Imperial freighters, shut down in a matter of hours. Imperium security forces stormed the markets, seizing all interstellar goods. Human officials and diplomats who had spent decades working with the Imperium found themselves imprisoned, some executed for crimes against the Empire. When the first planetary defense systems were shut down remotely, panic set in. The realization hit hard. Humanity had no say in its own fate. The Imperium did not just exile humanity. It crippled it. On Mars, once a thriving hub of trade, Imperium warships arrived to enforce the embargo. Colonists trying to flee were shot down before they could reach their ships. Supplies stopped flowing. Water, food, medical supplies, everything that had once come through Imperial trade routes vanished overnight. The outer colonies fared even worse. The ones on the fringes, barely self-sustaining, had been completely reliant on the Imperium for supplies. Without shipments of processed air and fuel, their life support systems began to fail within days. Desperate distress calls flooded comm channels, but no one answered. The Imperium's response was clear: you do not matter. For a week, Earth waited. Surely, someone in the Imperium would intervene. Surely, not every alien race under the Imperium's rule would stand by and watch an entire species be cast aside. But the galaxy remained silent. Rioters took to the streets in despair. The governments of Earth scrambled to maintain order. But what authority did they have now? There was no one to appeal to, no higher power that would come to their aid. News reports turned grim. Food supplies dwindled, energy grids faltered, and soon even the wealthiest districts felt the strain. The worst came when the Imperium ordered its final act of cruelty. Every human colony, station, and ship that had been part of the Empire's fleet was given a final message: surrender all assets to the Imperium or face destruction. Some obeyed, laying down their weapons, surrendering ships, and abandoning hope. Others fought. They were cut down. Earth's military, once proud and disciplined, fractured. Many leaders, still clinging to the hope of diplomacy, urged restraint. Others, seeing the Imperium's true nature for the first time, called for war. But war was impossible. The Imperium was too strong. Within 2 weeks, Earth was not just abandoned. It was helpless. Then the blockade began. Vael'Drak warships settled into position just outside the Sol system, ensuring that no one, no desperate human ship, no fleeing refugee would escape. If Earth had any illusions of reaching out to potential allies, Those dreams died in the vacuum of space. Not everyone accepted defeat. Deep in the shattered remains of Earth's government, a meeting took place. Military officers, scientists, former diplomats, those who understood that this was not just an act of exile. It was a death sentence. The Imperium has taken everything from us, General Elias Vance, once a high-ranking officer in the Imperium's auxiliary forces, said. They've shut us out, left us to die. If we don't act now, humanity ends here. There's nothing left to act with, replied Minister Aiko Matsuura, her voice hollow. We have no fleets, no allies, no supply lines. We are alone. Silence filled the war room. Then a quiet voice spoke. No, said Admiral Kane Varys, a man once tasked with defending Imperial space. We're not alone. There are others. The Imperium has oppressed more than just us. There are species who hate them as much as we do. Pirates who want their trade routes. Soldiers who lost their homes. We can survive, but not by playing by their rules. A dozen eyes turned toward him. What are you suggesting? Matsuura asked. We stop thinking like subjects, Varys said, and start acting like outlaws. It was in that moment, in the dim light of a failing Earth, that the first seeds of resistance were planted. Humanity would not beg. Humanity would not break. The Imperium thought exile was the end. It was only the beginning. The Vael'Drak Imperium had underestimated them. They believed that by casting humanity into exile, they had sentenced it to death. They thought the loss of resources, infrastructure, and allies would break their spirit, that humanity would scatter, turn on itself, and fade into irrelevance. They were wrong. Stripped of their place in the galaxy, humanity did not die. It evolved. The first year after the exile was the worst. Earth, the cradle of humanity, had been abandoned. The colonies that had not already been wiped out by starvation or sabotage were on the brink of collapse. The blockade surrounding Seoul ensured that no help could reach them, and those few ships that managed to slip through faced immediate pursuit from the Imperium's patrols. Only the desperate or the ruthless had a chance of survival. They fled to the dark places of the galaxy, the lawless sectors where Imperial rule had never fully taken hold. The asteroid belts where smugglers made their living. The shadowy outposts ruled by warlords and mercenaries. The hidden nebulae where pirate fleets gathered. These were places the Imperium feared to tread. And so, humanity made them home. At first, it was a matter of simple survival. Those who made it out alive bartered for food, fuel, and weapons, whatever they could scavenge. They traded human knowledge, technology, and expertise to the highest bidder, forging uneasy alliances with criminals, outcasts, and rebels. The proud diplomats of Earth found themselves haggling with slavers for engine parts. Once noble generals stood side by side with smugglers, learning the tricks of illicit trade. Scientists who had once designed peaceful innovations now worked on stealth technology, hacking systems, and weapons capable of crippling Imperium warships. Humanity had spent centuries following the rules. Now, there were no rules. The first ships were little more than patched-together wrecks, stripped-down freighters with stolen Vael'Drak weaponry. They were crude, unreliable, and barely held together. But they worked. With every raid on an abandoned supply depot, with every stolen shipment of goods meant for an Imperial garrison, the ships grew stronger. The pilots learned to fly without relying on conventional trade routes, using asteroid fields and gravitational anomalies to evade pursuit. Engineers discovered ways to splice Imperium technology into human vessels, modifying power cores and shielding systems to outmatch their expectations. And, most importantly, humanity learned how to fight on their own terms. They couldn't match the Imperium in raw strength. No single human fleet could stand against an armada. But they didn't need to. They became ghosts in the void, striking at supply lines, disappearing into deep space before the enemy could retaliate. They learned how to make themselves invisible, how to jam sensors and manipulate hyperspace signatures. They mastered asymmetric warfare. The first true test came when an Imperium warship, the Vael'Dran's Fury, ventured into outlaw space, hunting rumors of human activity. It never returned. The battle was swift, brutal, and precise. Humanity's ships didn't engage in a fair fight. They disabled the Fury's engines first, trapping it in a gravity well. They overloaded its comms, cutting off its distress signals. By the time the Vael'Drak realized what was happening, it was too late. The ship was taken intact. Its technology was stripped, analyzed, and repurposed. Its crew was given a choice: swear loyalty to humanity or be left in the cold void. Some refused. Others, seeing the cracks forming in their once mighty empire, made a different choice. The Black Fleets had their first Imperial defectors. Humanity was not the only species that had suffered under the Imperium's rule. The Vael'Drak had many subjects, and not all were content. The R'lyeh, a reptilian race known for their formidable warriors, had once been a proud empire before being conquered. The Kelnari, masterful engineers, had been subjugated and forced to build weapons they would never wield. The Nithari, whose homeworld had been turned into an Imperium fuel depot, had long awaited a chance to strike back. For centuries, these races had lived under the yoke of their oppressors. Then humanity arrived, exiled and furious, with nothing left to lose. The first alliances were small: mercenaries, outcasts, rebels with no clear goal beyond causing havoc. But as humanity proved itself, the factions grew bolder. An underground network began to take shape, a coalition of species united not by shared history, but by shared hatred. The Vael'Drak had always believed their empire was unshakable, that no species could ever pose a true threat. But they had never faced an enemy like this. They had never faced an enemy who refused to die. For the first few years, the Imperium dismissed the attacks. They assumed the missing supply convoys were accidents, that the raided stations were the work of common criminals, that their patrols had simply gotten lost. But as the losses mounted, they could no longer ignore the truth. Entire shipping routes had become too dangerous to travel. Outer Rim colonies were reporting mass desertions. Some warships, sent to investigate, simply vanished, their wreckage never found. The term ghost fleets began circulating among Imperium officers. Rumors spread of an invisible enemy, an enemy that could strike anywhere and leave no trace. An enemy with no homeworld, no borders, and no mercy. And then, the Imperium intercepted its first real message from the Exiled. A transmission broadcast across encrypted Imperial channels. A simple message from the Black Fleets. A message that sent a chill through the highest levels of the Imperium's command. You should have killed us when you had the chance. Humanity had transformed. They were no longer the obedient subjects who had begged for a place at the Imperium's table. They were no longer the desperate survivors clinging to scraps of civilization. They had become something else. A force the Imperium could no longer ignore. A storm on the horizon. And soon, that storm would break upon the Empire itself. The Imperium had made a fatal mistake. When they cast humanity into exile, they thought they had broken them, that the species would splinter, starve, or fade into the darkness of the void. But instead of disappearing, humanity had adapted. They had stolen technology, forged alliances, and mastered the art of asymmetric warfare. Now, they were ready for the next step. Not survival, not piracy, rebellion. It began in the deepest shadows of the outlaw sectors, far beyond the Imperium's watchful eyes. A network had formed, a loose web of ships, stations, and hidden bases, connected by encrypted comm relays and informants embedded within the Imperium itself. The Black Fleets had already proven they could bleed the Empire. Now, they needed something more. They needed leadership. They needed a war council. Representatives from the scattered human factions met in secrecy aboard a stolen Vael'Drak battleship, now repurposed as a mobile command center. Some were former military officers who had escaped execution. Others were smugglers and warlords who had profited from humanity's exile. And a few were simply those who had suffered the most, driven by nothing but vengeance. At the head of the table sat Admiral Cain Varys, a man who had once commanded Imperial forces in humanity's name. A man who had watched the Imperium cast his people aside like waste. Now, he led the Black Fleets, and his voice carried weight. He looked across the table at the hardened faces before him, some eager for war, some cautious, all aware that what they were about to do would change the fate of their species forever. "We've survived," Varys began, his voice steady. "We've stolen their weapons, crippled their supply lines, and turned their warships into our own. But surviving isn't enough. The Imperium will never stop hunting us. As long as they stand, we will always be fugitives, always be outlaws." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. "We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on," Varys continued. "But we don't need to. The Imperium is already rotting from within. Their emperor is dead. Their noble houses are tearing each other apart for power. Their fleet is stretched thin across the stars, fighting a dozen wars they don't have the resources to win." He leaned forward, eyes cold and unyielding. "This is our moment. We don't just raid them anymore. We don't just survive. We rise." A silence followed. Then a single voice spoke. "How?" The question came from Elias Vance, a former general of Earth's auxiliary forces. A man once sworn to serve the Imperium, now one of its most wanted traitors. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. "You speak of war," Vance said, "but war needs strategy. It needs resources. It needs time. We have all three," Varys answered, "and we have something they don't." He tapped a control on the table, and a hologram flickered to life. A massive galactic map, pulsing with marked locations, Imperial supply depots, strategic bases, key hyperspace lanes. "This," Varys said, "is how we win." The War Council spent weeks refining their strategy. Step 1. Expand the network. Humanity had allies, reluctant ones, scattered and fearful, but allies nonetheless. Rebel factions among the Kelnari engineers. Dissident noble houses of the Vael'Drak, eager to see the Empire fall. Entire mercenary clans who had been cast aside by the Imperium's growing paranoia. They needed to be united. Step 2. Destabilize the Imperium. Direct military engagement was suicide. Instead, the resistance would target the Empire's weaknesses, crippling hyperspace relays, sabotaging supply convoys, assassinating key officials. They would force the Imperium to fight itself. Step 3. Seize the opportunity. The Imperium's succession crisis was already dividing its forces. Civil war was inevitable. When the time was right, humanity wouldn't just join the war. They would end it. The first coordinated attack came at Outpost 77, a minor refueling station on the edges of Imperial space. It was a test, a way to see if the resistance could work together, if their stolen strategies could hold against real Imperial forces. 3 human ships emerged from the void, disguised as traitors, using stolen transponder codes. By the time the Imperium's security forces realized who they were, it was too late. The raiders struck with precision. The station's communications were jammed. Power grids were shut down remotely by hacked control nodes. By the time reinforcements arrived, the fuel stores were already burning, turning the outpost into a dead husk. The resistance left a single message, scrawled across a bulkhead in seared plasma. "We are not your slaves." Over the next few months, the attacks escalated. Imperial outposts burned. High-ranking governors were found dead in their beds, assassinated by operatives who had once been Imperial officers themselves. Sabotage swept through the Empire, leaving warships stranded in deep space, weapons failing mid-battle. The Imperium's response was brutal. Entire settlements were razed in retaliation. Planets suspected of harboring rebels were bombarded into submission. The Imperium declared that any species aiding humanity would be considered enemies of the state. They expected fear. They got defiance. Because for every act of terror the Imperium unleashed, 100 more humans rose to fight. The resistance was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It was a movement. It was a war. It was in the wreckage of an Imperial dreadnought that the resistance delivered its first direct message to the ruling council. A transmission, hacked into the Imperium's central command network, played across the capital world itself. Admiral Varys appeared on the screens. "You exiled us," he said, voice steady. "You thought we would die, that we would beg for mercy." He leaned forward, eyes filled with cold fury. You were wrong. The transmission cut to a series of burning Imperial ships, the wreckage of once mighty fleets drifting in space. A dozen rebel victories, all compiled into a single, undeniable truth. We are not your subjects. We are not your servants. We are not your forgotten exiles. He let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final words. We are your end. The screen flickered out, and for the first time, the Imperium truly understood what it had created. They had not merely exiled a species. They had forged their own destroyers. Humanity's resistance had been born, and soon, the Empire would burn. The Vael'Drak Imperium had ruled for thousands of years. It had conquered countless species, bent entire civilizations to its will, and crushed every rebellion before it could take root. It had become so vast, so powerful, that its rulers believed it could never fall. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance blinds even the greatest of empires. The cracks had been forming for centuries, growing slowly, like fractures in a great stone fortress. The nobles fought among themselves for influence. The outer colonies simmered with discontent. The once mighty military had grown complacent, stretched thin by expansionist wars and bureaucratic corruption. Then the emperor died, and the Imperium began to tear itself apart. For the first time in a millennium, the Imperium had no clear ruler. Emperor Vael'Drak III had reigned with an iron grip, holding the noble houses in check with fear and ruthless efficiency. But he had left no surviving heirs. His death, some whispered by assassination, had thrown the Imperium into chaos. The High Chancellor attempted to declare emergency rule, but he was swiftly executed by House Dravan, one of the most powerful noble families in the Empire. They claimed the throne by right of blood, only to be challenged by House Scifi, whose war fleets blockaded the capital within days. Civil war was inevitable. The Imperium's ruling class, once untouchable, had turned inward, more focused on seizing power than defending their crumbling empire. And while they fought each other, humanity moved in the shadows. The Imperium had always believed that if war ever came, it would be from an external threat, a rival empire, an alien coalition, something grand and visible. But their greatest enemy was not a rival state. It was the Exiled. The resistance had evolved beyond scattered raids. Now, they operated with precision, taking advantage of the Imperium's growing instability. Key hyperspace relays were sabotaged, throwing military communications into disarray. Entire battalions defected, swayed by bribes, propaganda, or sheer desperation. In the lawless border systems, pirate factions once loyal to the Imperium began to swear allegiance to humanity's cause. And then came the ghost fleets. A dozen Imperial governors received identical messages on the same day, warnings that their planets had been marked, that their supply chains would be severed, their defenses neutralized, that if they did not sever ties with the Imperium, their worlds would burn. Some scoffed. A week later, 3 major supply worlds went dark. Their shipyards turned to slag, their orbital defenses stripped and left adrift. Survivors spoke of unseen enemies, warships that did not appear on sensors, soldiers that struck from the void and vanished without a trace. Entire sectors began to fall into chaos. The Imperium's warlords, already consumed by their own battles for dominance, found themselves caught between rival factions and an enemy they could not track, could not predict, and could not stop. For the first time in history, the Vael'Drak Imperium was afraid. The Resistance's first major coup came when they infiltrated the stronghold of House Scifi. Scifi had long been one of the Imperium's most feared ruling families, known for their brutal tactics and unwavering loyalty to the Empire. Their forces had led countless planetary purges, ensuring that rebellious species were brought to heel. Now, they were humanity's target. The attack came in the dead of night. A fleet of disguised merchant ships drifted toward Scifi's primary shipyards, using stolen transponder codes to bypass security. When the orbital defenses realized the deception, it was too late. Explosive charges detonated across the docks, destroying half of Xyrath's fleet before they could launch. Then came the ground assault. Resistance operatives, led by Elias Vance, infiltrated the noble estate, cutting through elite guards with brutal efficiency. The battle was swift and one-sided. Humanity had learned from the Imperium's own tactics, using stealth technology and cyber warfare to cripple their foes before a single shot was fired. By dawn, House Xyrath was no more. The nobles were executed, their insignias burned, their wealth redistributed to fund the resistance war machine. The message was clear. No imperial family was untouchable. The loss of House Xyrath sent shockwaves through the empire. If one of the great ruling families could fall, none were safe. For the first time, the Imperium acknowledged humanity as a true threat. Imperial warlords who had dismissed the rebellion now scrambled to fortify their holdings. Mercenaries were hired in desperation, fleets were pulled back from expansion zones, and security protocols were rewritten. But it was too little, too late. The Imperium was still too consumed by its own civil war. Every noble house sought to protect itself first, none willing to unite against the growing storm. And in the midst of this chaos, humanity delivered its next blow, the Battle of Eralis Prime. Eralis Prime was one of the last major supply hubs still loyal to the Imperium. A fortress world, heavily defended, it had been deemed untouchable. But the resistance didn't attack with brute force. They hollowed it out from within. Saboteurs infiltrated the planetary defense systems, shutting them down from the inside. Resistance fleets jammed communications, isolating the garrison from reinforcements. And then the Black Armada arrived. Hundreds of resistance ships, former Imperial warships, pirate vessels, and custom-built stealth cruisers emerged from hyperspace. The defenders, cut off and outmatched, stood no chance. Within hours, Eralis Prime fell. The Imperium's last major stronghold in the outer systems had been lost. The once mighty empire was crumbling, and the galaxy was watching. Across the stars, species who had once cowered under the Imperium's rule now saw an opportunity. If humanity, exiled, alone, abandoned, could stand against the Empire, then perhaps they could too. The rebellion was no longer just humanity's fight. It was becoming something greater. A revolution. A movement that would change the galaxy forever. The Imperium's rulers, once so sure of their dominance, now faced a terrifying truth. Humanity was not coming to beg. Humanity was coming to conquer. And soon, the Empire would face its final reckoning. The Imperium had grown, used to its wars being predictable. Civilizations that rebelled did so in open defiance, raising banners and calling for revolution. The Vael'Drak knew how to deal with those uprisings, brutal planetary bombardments, mass executions, and crushing military campaigns. But this war was different. Humanity did not declare open rebellion. They did not meet the Imperium in the field for grand battles of honor. They struck like ghosts, like a virus infecting the Empire's body from within. And now, as the Imperium's noble houses waged war against each other in a bloody succession crisis, humanity saw its moment. The time for survival had ended. Now it was the time to strike. The Kalos shipyards were the heart of the Imperium's military-industrial complex. Located deep within the Empire's core systems, Kalos was responsible for building nearly half of the Imperium's warships. A fortress in every sense of the word, its orbital docks were protected by planetary defenses, automated gun platforms, and an entire fleet station nearby. It was untouchable, and that was exactly why humanity chose it. The plan had been in motion for years. Resistance spies embedded themselves within the shipyards, working their way into security teams, engineering crews, and logistics. False repair requests were submitted, creating blind spots in the station's defensive grid. Old Imperial codes, stolen from defectors, were quietly injected into the system, waiting to be activated. Then, the final piece was set in place. An Imperial dreadnought, seemingly damaged in battle, limped toward Kalos requesting emergency repairs. Its crew was all human, and no one noticed. The attack did not begin with weapons fire. It began with silence. At precisely 0200 Galactic Standard Time, every security system in Kalos flickered offline. A minor glitch, the engineers thought. Then the emergency power failed. And before the alarms could even sound, the docks were already crawling with resistance soldiers, disguised as Imperial workers. By the time the first shots were fired, it was already too late. The Imperium's defenders scrambled, but their own defenses were compromised. Airlocks sealed at the wrong moments, trapping entire squads in corridors that vented into space. Weapons systems malfunctioned. Automated turrets turned on their own troops. Humanity had spent years studying the Imperium's technology. Now they used it against them. Then, the dreadnought revealed its true nature. Its hull split open, releasing hundreds of attack craft, stolen Imperial fighters, retrofitted for stealth. Within minutes, the docks erupted in flames as ships exploded on their moorings. Warships, still under construction, were sabotaged, their engines rigged to detonate. One by one, the shipyards burned. The Imperium's fleet scrambled to respond, but it was disorganized. The admirals in charge had been caught completely off guard. Kalos was supposed to be impenetrable. By the time reinforcements arrived, resistance ships were already slipping away, vanishing into hyperspace. The shipyards, once a symbol of the Imperium's military might, were reduced to wreckage. The destruction of Kalos wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. Humanity had just crippled the Empire's ability to build warships, and there was nothing the Imperium could do to undo it. A transmission was sent across every major Imperial world. A simple message, played on repeat. Admiral Varys stood aboard a captured Imperial warship, his eyes calm, his voice steady. Kalos is gone. The transmission cut to images of the burning shipyards, Imperial dreadnoughts torn apart, debris drifting in the void. You believed exile would break us, Varys continued. You believed we would fade into history, forgotten. He leaned forward. You were wrong. A pause. This is only the beginning. And then the screen went black. The attack sent shockwaves through the Empire. The loss of Kalos was unthinkable. Half the ruling houses had ships under construction there, fleets they had planned to use in their civil war. Now, those fleets were gone, and humanity had proven something terrifying. They could strike at the heart of the Imperium. No world was safe. No fortress was untouchable. For the first time in its history, the Empire was truly afraid. The remaining noble houses, desperate to maintain control, declared all-out war on humanity. Rewards were placed on the heads of known resistance leaders. Entire planets suspected of aiding humans were razed in retaliation. But it was too late. Fear had already spread. The Imperium wasn't just fighting a civil war anymore. It was fighting for survival. Kalos was the turning point. The resistance was no longer just an insurgency. It was an army. Fleets of former Imperial ships, pirate vessels, and black market warships gathered in hidden star systems, preparing for the final phase of the war. The Imperium's hold on the galaxy was slipping. Its fleets were breaking apart. Its citizens, once loyal, now whispered of rebellion. And at the center of it all, humanity stood ready. The time for shadows was over. The time for war had come. The Imperium had once cast humanity into the void, expecting them to disappear. Now, that void was filled with fire. And soon, the Empire itself would burn. The war was almost over. The Vael'Drak Imperium, once the greatest power in the galaxy, was now a fractured husk of its former self. The noble houses that had ruled with iron fists for millennia were in ruins, their fleets shattered, their strongholds reduced to debris. Humanity had won. But victory was not the end. Victory was a question. Now that they had broken the Empire, what would they build in its place? Aboard the flagship Exile's Vengeance, the Resistance's leaders gathered for the final time. They'd spent years fighting, surviving, and striking back. But now, the Imperium's capital world, Vael'Drak Prime, lay vulnerable. No one could agree on what to do next. "The Imperium is finished," said Elias Vance, his scarred hands gripping the edge of the war table. "Their fleets are gone. Their armies are shattered. The time for half measures is over. We take Vael'Drak Prime, wipe out what remains of their ruling class, and burn the empire to the ground. Murmurs of approval echoed through the room. But Aiko Matsura, the strategist who had helped orchestrate the rebellion's victories, shook her head. And then what? We erase the Imperium, but what fills the void? Chaos? Anarchy? If we burn everything, we'll be no better than they were. Vance scoffed. Better? They exiled us. They tried to kill us. We owe them nothing but fire. Matsura met his gaze, calm but unyielding. And if we become conquerors? If we take their throne and rule in their place? Then we've done exactly what they feared. Silence fell over the war room. All eyes turned to Admiral Cain Varys, the man who had led humanity from the shadows, the man whose voice had declared war against the Empire, the man who would now decide its fate. The invasion of the capital was inevitable. Even in its final days, Vael'Drak Prime remained a fortress. Its planetary defenses, while weakened, were still formidable. The last remnants of the Imperium's fleet gathered above the world, a desperate final stand. The resistance attacked in waves. They had learned from the Imperium's own tactics, deception, disruption, overwhelming force at the weakest points. They hacked the planetary grid, turning defense platforms against each other. Stealth bombers disabled orbital cannons before the main fleet arrived. On the ground, resistance forces moved in swiftly. The once glorious capital was a battlefield, streets filled with burning wreckage. The last loyalist troops fought fiercely, not for victory, but for pride, for a dying empire that no longer existed. And then, at last, they reached the Imperial Palace, the throne room of the Vael'Drak Imperium. It was over. The last ruler of the Imperium, High Lord Vael'Drak Vael'Drak, the aging noble who had once dismissed humanity as an inferior species, stood before them, his once magnificent robes stained with blood and dust. You have your revenge, Vael'Drak said, his voice hollow. Take your place upon the throne. Rule as we once ruled. He knelt defeated. Varys stared at him, then at the gilded throne behind him. This was the moment. The choice. If Varys chose destruction, the Imperium would be erased. The last remaining Vael'Drak nobility would be executed. Their planetary networks would be dismantled. Humanity would leave nothing behind but ruins. A purge, a reckoning, a final act of vengeance for the centuries of suffering the Imperium had inflicted. There would be no rulers, no conquerors, only ashes. But war would not end. With the Imperium gone, the galaxy would fracture. Rival warlords, alien factions, mercenary kings, each would seek to carve out their own empire in the power vacuum. An age of chaos. And perhaps, in time, another empire just as cruel would rise in its place. If Varys chose conquest, humanity would become the new rulers of the galaxy. The Imperium's infrastructure would remain intact, but under human control. Order would be maintained. The noble houses that survived would kneel or be eliminated. Humanity would do what no other species had done before. They would rule. But was that what they had fought for? Would they be any different from the Imperium before them? Or had the war changed them? Had exile forged something new? A species no longer willing to bow, but also unwilling to repeat the mistakes of the past? Varys stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the chamber, across the ruined palace, across the world. The Imperium is finished. Vael'Drak bowed his head, waiting for the execution. But Varys did not draw his weapon. Instead, he turned to his soldiers. His people. This war was never about taking power, Varys said. It was never about becoming what they were. He turned, looking out over the burning city at the stars beyond. This war was about freedom. The resistance leaders exchanged glances. Some were pleased. Others, like Vance, clenched their fists in frustration. But no one spoke against him. Varys looked down at the defeated High Lord. Your empire is dead, he said, and we will not replace it. Then he turned away, leaving the throne empty. A revolution, not a conquest. A beginning, not an ending. With the Imperium dismantled, the galaxy entered a new era. Some planets chose independence. Others formed alliances. Former imperial territories broke into factions, some embracing democracy, others descending into chaos. Humanity did not rule over them, but they did not vanish either. The Black Fleets remained, not as conquerors, but as guardians, ensuring that no empire like the Vael'Drak would ever rise again. And in the darkest corners of space, whispers of a new power spread. Not an empire, not an oppressor, but something else. Something that watched. Something that waited. Because humanity had learned one thing above all else. Power is never permanent. And should another empire rise to enslave the galaxy once more, they would return, as the storm they had always been. The war was over. The Imperium had fallen. The galaxy, once ruled by the iron grip of the Vael'Drak, now stood on the precipice of something new. Fractured worlds declared independence. Noble houses that once commanded fleets were now refugees, and humanity, once the exiled, had become the storm that reshaped the stars. But the war had not ended for everyone. There were still those who resisted, those who believed the Imperium could be rebuilt. And for them, humanity had only one message: bow or burn. While Vael'Drak had fallen, not every sector of the Imperium had accepted its fate. Admirals who had fled the capital regrouped in the outer systems, rallying what remained of their forces. The most fanatical noble houses refused to surrender, retreating to their fortified worlds, vowing to fight to the last. They were remnants of a dead empire, clinging to power that no longer existed, and humanity had no patience for them. The Black Fleets mobilized. They did not send diplomats. They did not offer terms. Instead, fleets of warships arrived over the remaining loyalist strongholds, their message simple: submit or be erased. Some chose surrender. The wise ones knew that the war had already been lost, that defiance was nothing but suicide. They laid down their weapons, swore fealty to the new galactic order, and were allowed to keep their lives. But others chose to fight. They thought they could resist, that their planetary defenses could hold. They thought they could strike back, reclaim what had been taken. They were wrong. The bombardments were swift and merciless. On Drexos 4, the last fleet of House Dravon made their stand. They had once commanded 1,000 warships. Now, they had only 30. They refused to bow. The Black Fleets arrived in force, cutting through their defenses with ease. The battle lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, Drexos 4 was no more. A warning to the rest. On Keltari, the noble remnants barricaded themselves in underground bunkers, believing they could wait out the storm. That one day, the Imperium would rise again. The resistance had no interest in waiting. Deep penetration charges were deployed, seismic bombs that shattered the very foundations of their strongholds. The bunkers collapsed, burying the last remnants of imperial aristocracy beneath a mountain of rubble. On Velcara Station, the final broadcast of an Imperium warlord declared that humanity had become the very thing it had sworn to destroy, that they were no different than the oppressors they had fought against. His transmission was cut short by the detonation of his own reactor core. By the end of the campaign, no loyalist resistance remained. The Imperium was truly, completely dead. With the war won, humanity faced a choice of its own future. They had refused to take the throne of the Imperium. They had denied the path of conquerors. But that did not mean they would simply vanish. The Black Fleets remained, not rulers, but enforcers. A warning to any who would seek to replace the Imperium's tyranny with their own. Vael'Drak, the former capital of the Empire, became something new, not a throne world, but a neutral ground. A place where newly independent factions could negotiate, where peace could be forged, where the scars of the past could begin to heal. But even as peace settled across the galaxy, one truth remained. Humanity would never be victims again. As the last embers of the Imperium faded, a final message was sent across the stars. A broadcast from Admiral Varys himself, addressed not just to the remnants of the old empire, but to every species, every world that had been shackled under the Vael'Drak's rule. His face appeared on screens across the galaxy, his voice calm and measured. This war began because we asked for equality. A pause. and the Imperium exiled us. The screen flickered, showing images of humanity's suffering, burned-out colonies, blockade ships surrounding Earth, the execution of human officials in the early days of exile. They thought they had erased us, that we would fade into nothing, that we would beg to return to our place at their feet. His expression hardened. They were wrong. The images shifted, now showing the fall of the Imperium. Wrecked starships drifting in the void, noble houses crumbling, the black fleets standing victorious over Vael'Drak. We were forged in exile. We were shaped by war. We were made strong by the fire of their betrayal. He leaned forward. To those who suffered under the Imperium's rule, you are free. A beat of silence. To those who dream of forging a new empire of chains, we are watching. His voice dropped, quiet but filled with iron. And to those who would dare call us weak again. The broadcast cut to the burning ruins of the last Imperial strongholds, the worlds that had refused to surrender. Then his final words came. Bow or burn. The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity had returned, not as exiles, not as conquerors, but as the storm that would ensure no empire would ever rise again. Years passed. The scars of war remained, but new alliances formed. Independent worlds flourished. The Vael'Drak, once rulers of the galaxy, now lived among the species they had once oppressed, equals or outcasts. And humanity? Humanity became legend. They were not an empire. They had no throne, no sovereign ruler. They had no planets to call their own, no territory to govern. But they were always there, watching, waiting. The black fleets still moved in the shadows, unseen but ever present. Whispers of their presence drifted through the stars, of entire warlords vanishing overnight, of slavers' ships turned to drifting wrecks, of ruthless would-be conquerors meeting their end before they could rise. Humanity had no interest in ruling, but they would never let the galaxy forget, because they had learned one lesson above all. Power is temporary. Freedom must be protected. And if another empire dared to rise, to enslave, to oppress, then the exiled would return, and the stars would burn once more.